Fox News Alert, welcome back. With President Trump and the President of China sitting down for an expanded bilateral meeting, it comes in the shadow of Mr. Trump's decision to launch missiles against Syria, a decision he reportedly made right before meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping for the very first time yesterday at his Florida estate. So does the decision to take military action send a message to China? Michael Auslin is an expert on Asia with the American Enterprise Institute and the author of The End of the Asian Century. Thank you very much for talking to us. All right, so let's talk about how this all went down last night. I mean, the irony behind all of it, the importance of this meeting. So you've got President Trump. He's getting ready to sit down to dinner with the president of China, whose stance, as we all know, on Syria is to deal with them politically, peacefully. Then he makes a decision to strike a Syrian airfield used to launch that chemical attack. How is China perceiving all of this now?
Well, you're right, Julie. I mean, there was probably no more dramatic way that President Trump could seize the initiative from President Xi. You know, the worry going into this meeting is that the Trump team, first of all, they don't have a full team in place. They might not have a policy, that they might be the ones who are reactive and the Chinese would be pushing their agenda. Right now, the Chinese have to be on the back foot, thinking that everything they thought about Trump may be wrong.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. These two world leaders were expected to sit down and talk North Korea. They're expected to sit down again today for lunch before President Xi flies out to Florida, out of Florida. The purpose of the summit, talk about North Korea, talk about trade, and how China, specifically regarding North Korea, can help rein in Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs. The question now is it all in jeopardy? I mean, will the Syria strike affect China's bargaining position on North Korea?
Well, it certainly should make it easier for President Trump to start pushing his line on getting Chinese cooperation. I mean, you'd love to be a fly on the wall in that meeting to see how the Chinese body language has changed, maybe how some of their talking points have changed. You know, this is a president who has shown he can pivot on a dime, who can act decisively in ways that they really didn't expect. So if I were Trump, you know, now I'd be pushing on the Chinese to say, we really need you to not only put pressure on Pyongyang, but to put pressure on your own companies that are supporting this regime to the tune of billions of dollars a year. And the Chinese are going to think twice about saying no to that.
How does this strike strengthen Trump's bargaining position when it comes to dealing with North Korea and its nuclear weapons program and the pressure that not just this administration, obviously, but past administrations have tried to do and have failed in preventing Pyongyang from developing nuclear weapons, from test firing these missiles, et cetera?
Well, first, I think we need to recognize that, you know, doing a one-off airstrike on Syria is very different from engaging North Korea militarily. It would be a much bigger and much more risky operation to do anything against North Korea, which is why most American presidents have basically sat down and decided they weren't going to do much. But it has to put some fear into the minds of the North Korean leaders. They have to be thinking now, are we really sure that we can read the Americans and this new president the way we thought? I mean, if history is any guide, probably they're going to be a little quiet for some time, but this also is a new leader, Kim Jong-un. This is someone who most people that I've talked to in government and the intelligence circles feel is not like his father and grandfather. He is much more unpredictable, so it's going to be rough times ahead.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Five. I'm Kimberly Guilfoyle, and we have brand new developments and reaction tonight to President Trump's decisive response to Tuesday's heinous chemical attack in Syria. With last night's strike on a Syrian airbase, he sent a clear message to Bashar Assad and leaders of other rogue regimes. The rest of the world will not tolerate the use of weapons of mass destruction. Russia has condemned our military action and now has one of its warships steaming toward our two destroyers that launched the missiles. More on that in a moment. President Trump hasn't said more about the strike today. He's continuing his talks with China's President Xi Jinping about North Korea's arsenal. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, John Roberts, who is live in Palm Beach, Florida. John.
Kimberly, good afternoon to you. Of course, the big question in all of this is what comes next from two big standpoints. First of all, will Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, come to heel? And what is this going to do about U.S.-Russia relations, which are not particularly good at this point and look like they could be getting worse? First of all, on the first question, the United States, President Trump sent a very big message to Bashar al-Assad saying, if you keep doing what you're doing, you stand to lose everything. And today at the United Nations, the UN Ambassador Nikki Haley said that the United States is prepared to do more, though she hopes that that is not necessary. And Secretary of the Treasury Steve Mnuchin a short time ago made some news saying that the United States will soon be announcing additional sanctions on Syria in an effort to curb this behavior, believing that depriving people of doing business with Syria will help bring Bashar al-Assad to heel. Also, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said that they did not attack the runway at that air base. There was some news that some flights were still taking off from there. He said they did not attack the runway because it's a hardened runway, and even if they did damage it a bit, that could be fixed in hours. Now, to the second question of what will this do to U.S.-Russia relations, we see very strident public statements from people like the spokesperson for President Vladimir Putin, the foreign minister Sergei Lavrov, and the prime minister Dmitry Medvedev. However, I'm being told that while the public statements are somewhat strident, that the back-channel diplomatic communications between the United States and Russia have actually had very little blowback. Still, Secretary Tillerson said he is disappointed but not surprised by what he's hearing in public from Russia, because that shows that they are still backing Bashar al-Assad. The Secretary of State is headed to Moscow next week. He'll be having talks with his foreign minister counterpart there, Sergei Lavrov, next week. So that, I think, really will begin to tell the tale, Kimberly, as to how this is going to be going forward between the United States and Russia. But certainly it would seem to put to rest a lot of the talk that President Trump has been trying to coddle Russia. Wouldn't you say?
I would say. All right. Thanks, John, for that important update. And most of the world backs our strike, but not Iran, and especially not Syria's greatest ally, Russia. Vladimir Putin calls the military action illegal and a blow to U.S.-Russian relations. He's deployed one of his warships to the eastern Mediterranean to head toward our two Navy destroyers that launched the airstrikes last night. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson goes to Russia next week. Will he be able to get the country to rethink its support for Bashar al-Assad? So, Dana, very important international developments overnight with a very bold, decisive move by President Trump, and one that some critics are saying is not in accord with prior statements that he has made.
Which I think is fine. I mean, it is a little bit jarring for people who might have been supportive of such action when President Obama faced the same decision and then didn't do it. And then, anyway, I feel like what President Trump did last night was put America back on the geopolitical map. That for many years, these atrocities, including other chemical weapons that were being used, like chlorine gas, like how are we defining those in the last several years, where basically we're a hands-off approach? And what Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said last night is that this was in America's national interest. And I think that's important for lots of the rest of the discussion that we'll have today, and for the American people to understand that he said if there are weapons of this nature available in Syria, the ability to secure those weapons and not have them fall into the hands of those who would bring those weapons to our shores and harm American citizens, that this was one of the reasons that it had to be done. I also feel like there's no doubt that the world leaders have been trying to figure President Trump out since November 8th, and they got clarity last night. Final point from me is that any president, and President Bush used to talk about this, that any president is speaking to multiple audiences all at once. So our allies, our enemies, the American people, and our military. And I think what this also said to our military is that the strategy might not be perfect yet. It might not have been laid out. They've been working on a Syria strategy, the National Security Council and DOD. It's not quite there. This activity by Assad basically leapfrogged to the head of the line, and he decided to act. And I feel like he stood up for the decency that I believe makes America exceptional.
All right. So, Eric, you have been pretty firm in your resolve in terms of saying that we should not get involved in what's going on despite the humanitarian tragedy that obviously, affects everyone. How do you feel now in the aftermath and, seeing the specificity of the target and how it went down?
And so I saw this last night. I was watching it all develop. And I think Listen, so I woke up today, and then we had the whole Gorsuch meeting. I think today President Trump proved why I voted for President Trump and why a lot of people ended up voting for President Trump. On one hand, you have a conservative Supreme Court. It's got lost in the shuffle of what went on last night. But on the other hand, even though I disagree with attacking Syria with military force, he acted, as Dana points out, very decisively. We talked about it all day. But more importantly, for me, is he did it with Chinese President Xi right next to him, right? Just finishing dinner, goes ahead and calls for the launch. And now, whether or not the launch, the attack on the 59 Tomahawks that hit Syria are going to have effect on Bashar al-Assad, maybe it won't even have an effect. The effect that it did create was it told not only, you know, Kim Jong-un, his saber rattling going on there, you better watch out to him, but also that Chinese president realizes who he's dealing with right now. He's dealing with a man who's willing to strike another sovereign country while he's just finishing up a dinner with the other superpower on the globe. I mean,
and
there's
step out
no
and make a statement about it.
that Donald Trump, I disagree with the attack on Syria, but is definitive, decisive, and got the American people behind him with that launch. So I actually applaud what he did there, even though I disagree with the tactic.
There was no U.S. Troops on the ground to accomplish the goals. They were able to take out those sites. It was very successful mission, so at least those aren't things that you
I'm not sure the success has anything to do with the 59 that hit that airport. I think the success will have to do with the optics of it around the world.
All right, so I want to get your reaction on this, and we were just talking about this yesterday in terms of the options with Jennifer Griffin, and this is one of the things that I asked her about was alternative sites and perhaps hitting specifically the chemical sites and the air bases, notifying the Russians so that they have time. They had an hour to get out.
So what we know from the options that were given to President Trump by the Defense Department and his National Security Council is that he accepted the least powerful method, which was a limited cruise missile strike against specific air bases. So he didn't go after Assad personally. He didn't bomb his troops. No, he went after these air bases. They can be reconstructed. The question for me, and I think for lots of people in the Congress, is what's the end game? Because if you do, in fact, destabilize Syria by hurting Assad, do you plan then to go in and take over Syria? Oh, my goodness. I think that's what Eric Bolling is concerned about, is in terms of a prolonged U.S. military commitment that would mimic something like what happened when we went into Iraq, or our ongoing commitment in terms of Afghanistan. And we do have troops on the ground, as we heard yesterday, and those troops could be targeted for repercussions, either troops in Syria or in Afghanistan, even Turkey. So all of that is at play. But today, I think in the Congress, you saw something that was not, Kimberly, divided by Republican versus Democrat, but by people saying, so if this is a one-time, one-off deal, okay, but we don't know the end game, and if you're thinking, President Trump, about putting Americans on the ground, you know what, you better come to Congress. And don't forget, Trump is the guy who said during the campaign, unless there's a clear U.S. economic interest or national security interest, Dana says, well, the gas is, I think that's bogus. I don't see how that's going to be a clear national security interest for us. I don't, because I don't think
if the rest of their stockpile gets...
They don't have the capacity. Nobody has the capacity to bring it over here. In fact, the guy who has the capacity apparently would be Kim Jong-un over in North Korea. I don't think that's it. So what changed in Donald Trump's mind to say all of a sudden this impacts America? He has been making the case when he condemned Obama and even during the campaign to Clinton. There's no American interest in this. Stay out of it.
Right, but he also wasn't president then, and now he's president. He's privy to all the national security and intelligence reports and options, and it's his call. And based on those evaluations, he made it. Greg, can you talk to me a little bit about Russia, because they were given notification so that they were able to make sure that none of their personnel
I thought that was really nice of us.
It
was really nice. We let them know ahead of time. I love what this will do to the Russian narrative on other networks. Like, I guess Trump isn't Putin's puppet. The thing is, though, I think people are making a lot out of this. This is not war. This is the military equivalent of a public spanking. Assad just got whacked in aisle 3 of Walmart in front of all of his classmates. And that's the important thing. Yeah, it does. It's humiliating. Trump was tested by Assad, and he answered unlike President Obama. He kicked back hard. He didn't blink. This is important, and it's a message that is being sent. to North Korea, to Iran, to China, to Russia, that it's not about necessarily winning right now. It's about sending a clear message that there's a new sheriff in town. You can't expect him to do the predictable. There are a number of good things. I happen to agree with this.
Yes.
And I believe that it was when you talk about atrocity, when you talk about gassing kids, this to me feels like a reasonable response. I mean, I don't understand.
Not
this
proportional.
This is a targeted, specific, measured response. It also says, I'm committing to a red line. That's kind of refreshing. You know, it refutes the Putin's puppet narrative, and it shows that Trump is capable of surprising everyone from enemies to allies, and that's something he said he would do, and he did it. I think it's funny that he did it while he was having dinner with China.
Well,
that's like that's like essentially having a meeting and taking a phone call. You know, it does show that you can multitask, which often confuses other politicians. They're like, how can you do this and how can you do this? Well, he just does it. So there.
So Rand Paul called me today, and he said, let's have a little bit of discussion about what this is all about. And he knows where I am, that I'm in the camp that would disagree with that assessment that this actually changed anyone's mind in Syria. Like Assad, as Juan points out, was in Damascus, not at the airport, and he still has the capability to do it if he chooses to do it. I'm not sure that's going to change. But he said, and again, I asked Jennifer Griffin yesterday, what's the administration's purpose or the military's purpose here? Is it to kill Assad? And she specifically said,
no.
Not only not kill Assad, but not even regime change.
Well, first of all, killing Assad would be illegal. You cannot kill another world leader.
Russia says that what we did today was illegal.
Even if you really want to, you should. No one's ever going to say that's your goal.
But the Russians say what we did was an attack on a sovereign
nation. But the question is, then what, though? If it's not regime change and it's not kill Assad, then what?
Well, maybe it's, first of all, don't use that gas again.
Right.
Number one, and then we'll figure out the rest later. And by the way, I don't care what Russia says about, oh, the United States attacked a sovereign country. Are you kidding me? Ukraine in Crimea? Give me a break. That is ultimate fake news from.
Well, you know what the worst of it was? They also said that they don't think that this was caused by the chemical attack. They think this was pre-planned by the Trump administration, which, are you talking about?
But this is
the CIA. It's a false flag by the CIA.
This is the problem of calling legitimate news fake news, because what Russia does in terms of trying to deal with its domestic audience is spread fake news, actual fake news. That is not true.
I agree it's not true.
And the ridiculous conspiracy theories from even within the United States that somehow the rebels were actually put the chemical gas into the planes that Assad then used on us. And it was actually like some evil genius that figured that out. Like, our military has the video that shows it was their planes that were doing it.
Yeah,
the best response when somebody brings up, oh, that's false flag, that the chemical attack is a false flag, they go, oh, yeah, and so was our retaliation. That was a false flag as well. It's all complete
false
theater. Right. So you can't disprove me either.
Yeah, but it certainly has changed the geopolitical climate. But what a strong message to say the U.S. is not afraid to stand alone and act unilaterally, and that's what President Trump did last night.
And as John was speaking, we just got some word of military response from the Russians. Fox News has learned that a Russian warship, the Admiral Grigorovich, has entered the eastern Mediterranean. It cruised through the Straits of Bosphorus a few hours ago. It is now heading toward the two U.S. Navy destroyers that launched the airstrikes last night. Now, this is far from saying that there is a military confrontation ahead. Maybe it's just an information gathering mission. But for whatever reason, the Soviets have decided to send a frigate into the eastern Mediterranean in the same area where the two American destroyers are that launched those cruise missile strikes last night on Syria. We will keep our eyes on this Russian ship as best we can, let you know more about what's happening there. Some new details on the U.S. airstrikes on Syria. The guided missile destroyer USS Porter played a major role in launching that attack. Now a Russian warship in the eastern Mediterranean is heading toward the Porter and another Navy destroyer that launched those strikes. The developments raising serious questions about what comes next. A piece in the Washington Post reads, quote, "The biggest difference that Trump and his commanders confront now is the presence of Russian troops on the battlefield and Russian air defense systems that are capable of shooting down U.S. planes. Today, Russian troops are intermingled with Syrian forces, and any strike on a Syrian military target could also produce Russian military casualties. Mitchell Utterback is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces Lieutenant Colonel and a Colorado National Guardsman. Let's talk about this latest development, the Russian ship that is steaming toward the U.S. destroyers in the Mediterranean. Is that a threatening maneuver, or is it routine in circumstances like this?
John, I don't consider it a threatening maneuver. It's something that Russia has to do, and it's something that can make the international news like it's making today. But you can be assured, and we can all be assured, that we have the protection that our Navy needs out there in the Med. There is no threat to the U.S. from that Russian ship.
All right, what about the fact that Russian forces were known to be on the ground at this airfield? We're told that our Pentagon actually notified the Russians about an hour before the attack. Frankly, that surprises me, because the Russians could have then picked up the phone and called the Syrians, and they could have flown their planes out of there in that hour.
Well, John, we can probably assess that that's exactly what happened. The Russian advisors, the Russian chemical munitions experts, if that's what they were, certainly told their Syrian counterparts. But it's hard to find a Syrian jet pilot at 4 in the morning, and that's quite likely why most of those jets were destroyed on the ground. It is important that we did notify the Russians through the deconfliction line, because this isn't a direct kinetic strike against Putin's forces on the ground. It is quite literally, as we've been saying, enforcing that red line and departing from that policy of the previous administration's strategic patience. That's long since over. No better way to get that message across to the world than 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles instead of a speech.
Yeah. Is there any danger, do you think, of repercussions for the U.S. troops that are on the ground in Syria?
Well, just from open source news, we know that our U.S. troops are at a distance. They're in other parts of the country, and we're maintaining a significant separation from, obviously, Syrian and Russian forces. But our guys on the ground are following the news. They know what's going on, and I'm sure their force protection posture has increased as a result of the strike on the airfield.
You mentioned a strike on the airfield. There are 6 air bases that Bashar al-Assad controls. I mean, the U.S. could have gone a lot farther than it did. Do you suggest that this is roughly proportional? Is this about right in proportion compared to what Assad did in launching that chemical attack?
Well, that's the thing. WMD uses on your own civilians are out of proportion. You know, if we looked it up, there would probably be many more times people killed in the previous week by conventional munitions. But because of his violation of agreements that we and the international community had made with Russia and Syria, it was proportional, and we look for proportionality. But that doesn't mean that this can't happen again tonight. If he has other airfields, and I'm sure we're closely monitoring activity at those other airfields, so it's not beyond the pale that there'll be other strikes on other airfields to come if the indicators of other chemical munitions airstrikes are getting ready to take place.
We know that the Russians have sold and installed very sophisticated anti-aircraft weaponry on Syrian soil. How dangerous is that, you know, in the event that some kind of a manned aircraft strike might be needed?
Well, fortunately, we don't need to do that, John. This isn't Operation El Dorado Canyon when President Reagan sent the F-111s over Libya. We don't have to send pilots or just send machines now. We have the ability to send drones, and those Tomahawk missiles do the job that a single precision-guided bomb delivered by an airplane would do. So we will continue to use unmanned systems to get the job done.
Lieutenant Colonel Mitch Utterback. Mitch, thanks very much.
From Florida, President Donald Trump now set to meet with the Chinese president any moment now as we wait that, and the world is watching that meeting as well to see what level of pressure President Donald Trump can place on China with regard to North Korea and its nuclear missile testing. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott live in Seoul, South Korea, just back from the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, with more from there. Greg.
Hey, Bill, yeah, some analysts here are saying that President Trump, in sending those cruise missiles against Syria, was sending a message not just to Syria, but also to North Korea, China, that the military could be an option in this region as well. As we found out today, the U.S. military is ready for whatever. Take a look.
It helps when you're practicing with this stuff to be close to the real thing. These are multiple launch rocket systems. Soldiers are training, exercising on them. If they need to, they can fire a rocket or a missile from this vehicle over those mountains. North Korea, some 15 miles away.
U.S. forces here dealing with a North Korean conventional military, just as scary as the nuclear one. Over 1 million soldiers, tanks, thousands of pieces of artillery, plus one of the biggest stockpiles of chemical weapons in the world. Again, 28,000 U.S. troops drilling using radar to look for incoming, also drilling using long-range artillery aimed at spotting hotspots across the border, as well as offensive exercises. We watched troops work their way through a mock village, clashing with folks that were clearly supposed to be a North Korean foe, alongside South Korean soldiers for which they had high praise. Here's how one general described it all to us.
We respect, the potential of the forces to the north, but we like to say that our job here is to deter that aggression, and we train very hard every day so that they know we're ready in the event of transition to crisis.
By the way, Bill, these exercises drive Kim Jong-un absolutely crazy. His regime calls them a rehearsal for an invasion, a rehearsal for war. The officers we spoke with today have no intention of giving them up.
And we'll see what comes from Korea, and we'll see what comes from Florida. Greg Palcott, thanks. Good to have you on the ground there.
No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
The United States took a very measured step last night. We are prepared to do more, but we hope that will not be necessary.
The consequences of this for regional and international stability could be extremely serious.
If I were one of our Sunni Arab allies watching this, I'd be encouraged that America was back in the business of being more assertive, less passive.
Well, bipartisan support largely on Capitol Hill for the strikes that happened into Syria last night, 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles. In fact, some Democrats speaking out prominently. One of them, Anne-Marie Slaughter, in the Obama administration, Director of Policy Planning for the State Department under Secretary Hillary Clinton. She tweeted this: Donald Trump has done the right thing on Syria, finally, after years of useless hand-wringing in the face of hideous atrocities. Strong letter to follow there. There were obviously world reactions, and we're going to cover it all. Let's bring in our panel. Tom Rogan, columnist for National Review and Opportunity Lives. A.B. Stoddard, associate editor at Real Clear Politics. Charlie Hurt, opinion editor for The Washington Times, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Okay, Tom, thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was absolutely the right thing to do. President Trump didn't just act, he acted quickly. And in doing that, I think as Senator McConnell notes, he absolutely has put himself in a position of strength going forwards, whatever he decides to do next. Sunni Arab monarchies extremely happy, relieved. That helps in terms of reducing their impetus to fund groups like Al-Qaeda as a counterbalance to Iran. But on this specific issue of the rule of law in the world, whether the American anchor point will sustain, I think Trump took a major step forwards there. And if you look at the respective elation in governments across Europe at what has been done, I think it is the proof that this desire for American leadership was desperately desired.
As we put up Sean Spicer's tweet, after you're looking at this Tomahawk cruise missiles, Sean Spicer's tweet of the room where President Trump was, the image after the strike apparently was ordered at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Charles, the world reaction seemed like
again, it was respectful of the strength move.
I think it was extremely important for precisely that reason. It'll have its particular effects on the ground in Syria. It's a warning to Assad and the Russians and the Iranians. You no longer have a free hand. You're going to pay a price. Next time it'll be a bigger price. All of that is important. But I think the most important element here is that the world had looked at this area and seen the profound abdication for 8 years, where the United States had disappeared, and also the beginning of the Trump administration with a man who came into office, in fact, who said only a week ago, I'm not president of the world, I'm president of the United States. We'd have to look after our own interest here at home, who gave an inaugural address in which he essentially said, we are not interested in policing the world. And then this is a sort of neck snapping about face, which is extremely salutary. All of a sudden, as Tom said, the United States reacts, and quickly, unlike Obama, where you'd have weeks of public hand-wringing. Remember when he came up with the policy on Afghanistan? It took something like 8 months. This is about 48 hours, and America strikes. So I think that's the most important message, particularly important for the Chinese, for the Koreans, for the Russians. America is back, and it is liable to react now. You no longer have a free hand. And that, I think, is going to change a lot in the world from a single response like this.
We should note about that Russian ship in the Mediterranean. Russian ships are in the Mediterranean from time to time. This one moved in just today, where the other 2 U.S. naval vessels that fired the Tomahawk missiles. We're not insinuating that they're making an aggressive move, but it was moved there today. Here is the UN ambassador to the U.S., Nikki Haley, and the Russian ambassador.
It could be that Russia is knowingly allowing chemical weapons to remain in Syria. It could be that Russia has been incompetent in its efforts to remove the chemical weapons. Or it could be that the Assad regime is playing the Russians for fools.
We will recall that General Power, I believe in this very room, he talked about chemical weapons which were not found.
He's talking about General Colin Powell making the case before the UN Security Council about Iraq, AB. And it's interesting, as Russia makes the case that we don't have the evidence that they were chemical weapons.
You know, I agree with all the positive things that have been said so far, so not to repeat them. I think everything really so much lies in the hands now of the Russians, because they like to send conflicting signals, so they did last night and then again today. They usually say 3 things at a time that conflict with each other. What is going to happen at the meeting of the Secretary of State next week when he's in Moscow with his counterpart talking about Syria is so critical, because the question of what they did in 2013 with regards to removing all the chemical weapons, obviously they didn't. What they plan to do about that, a document released last night from the administration basically said the administration expects Russia to change its posture on Syria. I don't think they intend to do that. If they leave chemical weapons, if they were complicit in the attack, if they leave chemical weapons in Syria, do we respond this way every time there's a chemical attack? So you never want to criticize. There's always something to criticize, but truly Republican senators left a briefing today even saying out loud, what is the long-term strategy? And it's so dependent on the posture of the Russians.
Maybe a change in posture as far as backing Assad. You know, they may not have a problem if Assad per se leaves, but another Alawite in his tribe who takes over, and they sit at the table, and this then gets them to the table, Charlie, and it changes the dynamic. Perhaps that's the different posture.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that the Russians got a heads up, but obviously they didn't clear out any of the Syrian soldiers from the air base. And as we understand so far, no Russians were killed. But I do think that, you know, despite the bipartisan support for this in Washington, which there clearly is, and global applause for it, I think that we have to be careful about where we go from here, as AB said, because this is not what Donald Trump's supporters voted for him for. They voted for him not to do these sorts of things and not to get involved in a foreign conflict. And obviously lobbying 59 Tomahawk missiles is one thing. committing troops is an entirely different thing. But it's the idea that we're the world's policemen. He did, as Charles said, he ran on that, and they're going to have a very limited amount of patience if this escalates into something more than that.
Does this reset this administration?
I think that it does around here, obviously, because people, this is the first thing that he's done that anybody around in Washington has applauded.
I want to play this congressional reaction quickly.
This president reacted to events which were so horrific that it required American reaction.
I think they're illegal and unconstitutional, but no one's pretending that we were under imminent attack by Syria.
There are huge questions about the legality of this strike and how it sits within a broader Syria strategy.
He is the commander-in-chief. We have American troops in Syria. He has an obligation to protect them.
I think further steps than this, the Congress should weigh in. Congress should do what the Constitution requires, and that is declare war.
Tom, there are Democrats and Republicans saying if it goes further, need to come up to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, and I think he will. But in the baseline of the powers of the Commander-in-Chief, Article 2, Section 2, it's not that complicated. You look at the precedents, you look at Clinton, Kosovo, Obama, Libya. The president,
Libya.
Right, the president has the authority to do this. I think it would be the Supreme Court doesn't want to touch it because it's evident. I think the equitable point here, though, in terms of what Charlie is saying about the notion of what did Trump do, it's interesting to note that we have U.S. Army Rangers in the north. What are the Rangers specifically tasked with doing is their mission statement? Seizing airfields. I'm sure one of the options that Matt has presented to Trump was an incursion by that regard. That he didn't do that, I think, suggests that he wanted the response that was least likely to inflame some of those domestic political constituencies.
This is my two-chuck panel, by the way. Charles, final word here.
What he wanted to do was to send a message. He sent a message. He didn't attack all 6 airfields. He could have shut down the Air Force, but he just wanted to say, it's not that there's a new sheriff in town. There is a sheriff in town. There was an absence for 8 years. America is back, and you're not allowed to do whatever you want. That in and of itself is going to have a big effect.
So just to go over the timeline here, and this is an obvious different reaction we're seeing from a different president, Juan Williams. But that chemical attack launched by Assad happened on April 4th. A day later, the president ordered the Pentagon to come up with options. One day after that, President Trump then looked at those proposals, approved the orders, as you just heard Jennifer Griffin report, at 4 p.m. yesterday. That was quick action.
It was definitely quick action. The question is, and I think this is part of what Jennifer was talking about when we think about the action, the president's team looking at the possible repercussions. What does this mean? We have American troops on the ground in Syria and in adjacent countries. So what does this mean? What could the fallout be? And we're seeing fallout even today. But the question that remains for me is, when you look back at President Obama's action, the Congress, he sent a request for authorization to the Congress. The Congress didn't grant it. This morning you have people saying that President Trump acted without authorization, and they're willing to say he can act on a lone basis, an exigent basis in terms of American interest with the airstrikes that occurred last night. But what comes next? This is what Kennedy was talking about earlier. And if it's the case that we are going to have some long-term action, is the Congress willing to act at this moment? Because politically, and again I come back to something Kennedy was talking about, are the American people willing to say now we are agreeable, politically open to a long-term engagement in the way that we saw the U.S. get involved in Iraq?
Right. As the general was speaking, we're getting word from Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on what he deems a lackluster Russian response to all of this. Disappointed in response from the Russians, indicates their continued support for this regime. He's referring to the Assad regime in Syria. I find it disappointing but sad that I have to tell you that it's not all that surprising. Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer on this, retired U.S. Army intelligence, which begs that issue that I keep raising here, Colonel, that the one-off was not just one and off.
No, I think it's a tapestry, if you will, of capabilities which have now been brought back to the table. As stipulated in several of your reports leading up to this, the Obama administration, to a fault, removed military capabilities from any negotiation, I think that gave the State Department a huge disadvantage. And so let's be very clear on what's going on here. You now have a president who has acted, which then reinvigorates everything we're doing across the board, to include especially reinvigorating one of those things that people hate to talk about, which is our nuclear deterrence program. The Japanese have been very worried about a President Obama being willing and able to respond to a North Korean provocation. And let me be clear on this. The North Koreans do have nuclear weapons. My sources tell me it's very likely they've been very successful in linking these things to more than just Scuds. And I think what we now see, and I think there's a reason why, Neil, you saw the Tomahawk missiles hitting as Donald Trump was offering bread pudding and Brandy Alexanders to President Xi at dinner last night. I think the point was made, hey, the game has changed and everybody better pay attention.
You know, I always wonder how that would played last night in Mar-a-Lago, because he apparently stepped away from the dinner briefly to make the announcement and then go back in, I guess, say, pass potatoes. But whatever happened, I don't know. But, you know, Colonel, you could make the argument that if you're a wayward republic, a regime like that in North Korea, even to that in Syria, that hey, this might, you know, behoove you to move fast with your bad stuff. If you're North Korea and you got bad stuff, launch it now, do it now.
I don't agree. Again, having studied North Korea, worked the North Korean issue since the early 90s, I know for a fact that their primary objective is regime survival. So the moment that regime believes it is being threatened, I mean realistically threatened, that they can't act out anymore, I think that tends to be the thing. And remember, Neil, we have done, talk about the definition of insanity, we have done the same thing with the North Koreans time and time again.
No, you're right. Through Democratic and Republican administrations, you're absolutely right, Tony.
So now's a potential that this president may deviate from, I hate using this term, a paradigm shift from the past, and I think this means that there could be very well some different actions against North Korea than we've seen before.
All right, paradigm. I always thought it was paradigm, but paradigm. Oh, gotcha. All right, Tony Schaefer, thank you very much, my friend. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too, sir.
Senator John McCain is one of the most influential voices on military affairs, and he is applauding President Trump's call for the Syrian airstrike.
This president reacted to events which were so horrific that it required American reaction, and I believe that not only was the act itself important, but the signal that it sent to the world from President Trump was as important.
Joining me now is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. He is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Do you agree with what Senator McCain said?
Well, I think when you look at whether we go to war or not, it's one of the most important questions that any legislator will ever address. But I think it's ironic that this week we confirmed Neil Gorsuch, an originalist who believes in the original interpretation of the Constitution. But our founders in the original days believed that war should be declared by Congress. So I think before you even get into the debate of whether we should or shouldn't, we should start out with the law. And the law says that the president does not have the power to declare war, does not have the power to take us to war. And so I think that's the real problem with this issue. We didn't have the debate. We just simply went to war.
The argument on the other side of that would be that we are not at war, that he took an action in order to stop the killing that was going on. Now it is his responsibility to come to you and to agree together on the next step.
I guess the point is that we never know whether that initial salvo was the beginning of a war that will unleash thousands of bombs and involve hundreds of thousands of soldiers, or whether that was just sort of a warning shot and that's all it will be. So I don't think anybody knows that in the beginning, but I think those who try to argue that war is not war, that bombs are not killing, that death is not really death, and that kinetic action is not war, I think that's difficult. I think most regular Americans sitting at home watching the TV would understand dropping bombs on another nation to be war. And I'm not saying that, you know, what Syria did wasn't atrocious, you know, and that we aren't aghast at, you know, the pictures of the babies and children suffering from nerve gas. But we also have to understand that we'll be sending our young men, and we have some of our young men and women over there already, that they are there in the middle of this. And really, don't they deserve that we obey the Constitution and only take them into war according to our oath of office?
Now to the Capitol, where House Speaker Paul Ryan's spokeswoman releasing this statement moments ago saying, quote, "Last night's response was fully within the president's authority. It is now appropriate for the administration to consult with Congress as it considers next steps to resolve the long-running crisis in Syria." Joining us now to discuss all of this is Senator James Lankford. He is a member of both the Senate Intelligence Committee and the Senate Homeland Security Committee. What do you make of that statement, sir?
I think that statement's consistent with all the facts that we've seen as well. The president has authority to be able to protect national security, obviously to be able to protect what's happening. We have forces in the area. While this is a direct strike on the Syrian regime and Assad's forces, we have 20 to 30 different airstrikes a day that's happening in Syria right now against ISIS. So we're very active in that area and have some vulnerabilities there. Long term, we do have to resolve this. There's not an authorization for a use of military force or a long-term plan. It was one of the things that President Obama would never bring to us, is a long-term plan for what we need to do in Syria. There was conversation, but no plan.
Yeah.
We hope to be able to get that so we can actually develop what needs to happen next there.
Senator Rand Paul is coming up later on our program today. He thought that this action was unconstitutional. What do you say to that?
No, I wouldn't say it's unconstitutional, but it is time for the next step to be able to come out and say, okay, let's determine as the American people, and the American people decide together through the Congress and be able to work with the president, and the president carries that out. The president is commander-in-chief when the troops are in the field, but Congress is the one who actually calls them out. And so that is an essential part of our constitutional structure.
We understand that you're just emerging from a briefing on this. What did you learn? Anything new?
No, we walked through what happened, how it happened, the tick-tock of the evening. We walked through the assessments that they have now, and then we just talked through the process. Obviously, there's no plan for what happens next. A lot of it depends on Bashar al-Assad and what his response is. I would tell you that Assad does need to go. That should be a clear message from the administration. I wish it would have been a clear message from the previous administration. Nothing gets settled with ISIS long-term until you actually resolve what's happening with Assad. So this changes dramatically in Syria, and the situation changes when the leadership changes, and we have a transition of leadership there.
I know you were in that meeting. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to hear this, but this is Nikki Haley at the UN Security Council meeting. Let's play it. I'll get your reaction.
It could be that Russia has been incompetent in its efforts to remove the chemical weapons. Or it could be that the Assad regime is playing the Russians for fools.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about what Russia's role in this was. We all remember that Susan Rice assured us on NPR that they had removed chemical weapons through diplomacy. Obviously, they were there when this act took place. What do you think Russia's role and responsibility in this is?
Well, Russia clearly has responsibility. Russia was also the country that said that they were monitoring all this, they were evaluating this, they could sign off for the Syrians and say there were no chemical weapons there, that everything had been purged from it. So they're either lying to just the American people or to the entire world, or they were helping the Syrians be able to carry out this chemical weapons attack. Either way, this was deception, and it falls squarely on the shoulder of the Russians. Either they could have known, should have known, but they're Russians on the same base where they're storing, maintaining, loading, carrying out chemical weapons attacks. It's impossible for me to be able to believe the Russians when they would say, I didn't know, or their false accusation that somehow this was stored in one of these locations and the Syrians just hit the house where the rebels were using it is farcical. So there's no doubt the Syrians had it. There's no question that the Russians knew that they were using it. The Russians are absolutely complicit in this and should be responsible for helping either get rid of it and to be able to settle this. The best way they can do that is to help eject Assad out of this, who they are help protecting and propping up.
Senator, thank you. United Nations Security Council holding an emergency meeting today. U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley saying the U.S. military took a very measured step, but is prepared to do more. David Lee Miller joins us live from the United Nations in New York City. And what else did Ambassador Haley have to say?
The ambassador made a point of stressing that the U.S. has no doubt that Syria was responsible for the chemical weapons attack this week. She went on to say that such attacks would never again be tolerated. And she also said that there were other, in her words, guilty parties. And she singled out Iran as well as Russia. Listen.
Assad did this because he thought he could get away with it. He thought he could get away with it because he knew Russia would have his back. That changed.
Now, The Russian representative, who had already spoken, then asked to amend his remarks before the Security Council, and he talked at length not just about the United States and the airstrikes, but he singled out Ambassador Haley by name, who is now serving as the rotating president of the Council. Here's the ambassador, or the representative.
That I would have asked the speakers from the U.S. and other delegations not to insult my country. Ms. Haley has just assumed her new office, that she does have a genuine opportunity, and as the permanent representative of the U.S. and member of the Security Council, to establish a healthy, collective work environment in the Security Council.
It was an afternoon here of accusations as well as insults. This was one of the most uncivil Security Council meetings in recent memory. The representatives today, Melissa, here at the United Nations, diplomats though they may be, acted very undiplomatically. Back to you.
Wow, and Syria is not a member of the Council, but the delegation was given an opportunity to speak, right?
Indeed, the Syrian representative, the deputy ambassador, was here observing, and then he had the opportunity to speak, and he attacked the U.S. for what he called, quoting him now, barbaric, flagrant act of aggression. He then went on to say that Syria was in no way responsible for the use of chemical weapons this week, and he blamed the use of chemical weapons on what he termed terrorists. So what we have here now, Melissa, after a lengthy Security Council meeting, is a deeply divided council. It seems highly unlikely that any time soon any resolution is going to be passed on the subject of Syria, being especially mindful of the fact that Russia on this subject has used its veto power 7 times. Melissa?
David Lee Miller, thank you.